this time, I'd now like to introduce Diane Earp, who is Corporate Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs, Quality Assurance, and Records Management at RTI. She has over 25 years of experience working with various large and small companies and both nonprofit and government agencies to define and implement strategies for the development and regulatory submissions of new medical devices, drugs, and biologics. Diane?
Thank you, Patrick. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I'm going to start with a couple of disclaimers. If you would turn to slide 2, please, Patrick. We have a lot of objectives to try to meet here, and I honestly could spend at least an hour, if not 2, on each of these topics. So I may not be able to talk as fast as Mike did, but I'm going to try to cover things very quickly, and I am happy to have conversations with you offline or via email if I don't get to the material that you needed to get out of this presentation. There's just a lot of information. So we're going to try to hit the highlights. There's a lot of words on the slides. They'll be made available to you. And hopefully that will help kind of find the fine balance between taking up too much of your valuable time and getting you the information that you need. Next slide. So first of all, just defining what the FDA calls a medical device is something that is uniquely governed and in many cases varies from what some other folks may consider a device. But the primary message from this slide is that this is what's written into the regulations, and the intended use is what really drives what is considered a medical device versus some other instrument. The diagnosis, the mitigation, cure, treatment, or prevention of a disease that intends to affect the structure or function of the body. So when you're thinking about building this wonderful gadget, whether it's an instrument to do testing or to facilitate therapeutic recovery or even a software application, those types of intended use and affected structure of the body is what's going to drive whether or not it really is a medical device. So that's usually where we start, is what I'm building a medical device. Next slide. Once you determine that, yep, it fits this classification, it is a device, a medical device, now you have to go to the next level, which is how is it classified? Devices that are governed by the FDA are classified as 1, 2, 3, or class 1 or 2 exempt. The class 1 obviously is the lowest risk. It only has general controls. It requires quality management and oversight, but it doesn't require formal submission to the FDA prior to introducing it for market into general commerce. Class 2 is a medium risk where there are some special controls, and we frequently talk about it in the 510K submission process, unless it's an exempt status. Class 3 is our highest risk. There are a lot of controls and balances and data that has to be collected and submitted to the agency via PMA. It usually sustains life or has an excessive risk profile associated with it. So those are the classifications, and how you determine the classification really comes down to significant risk. Does the device have a potential for serious risk to the health or safety of patients and subjects? And does the IRB agree with the risk determination that you are proposing? Once you get those 2 questions answered, you'll be able to define more clearly your strategy. And quite honestly, the answer to these questions make the difference between a product going to market immediately or in 1 to 2 years or sooner versus up to 10 years in worst case scenarios. So that translates to dollars, investment needs, and may impact the potential of your new company to survive if you're building a new co. Devices in general are regulated by the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, referred to as CDRH, and sometimes with combined productization can fall into the responsibility of one of the other 2 centers at the FDA, but we'll get into that later. Next slide. So now that I've got you thoroughly ingrained in how do I decide whether I've got a medical device, what its classification is, and how significant its risk is, you've got this dilemma. When you don't know what the classification is, because it's kind of unclear, a predicate device, and we'll get into what that is, that falls under the 510K submission, can't be clearly identified. The risk profile is questionable. So now what are you going to do? Well, you could say you're going to call RTI and we're going to help you work through it. Or you could say, I need help from the FDA. There are ways to get that. The Q submission meetings that provide guidance and information exchange, a formal request for designation in which the FDA will provide feedback on classification, regulatory requirements, or a waiver or exemption that can change the pathway altogether. But getting the message here is that getting the FDA's concurrence with your position, your strategy early gives you the credibility to your investors and ensures you're aligned with their expectations regarding timelines and expected outcomes and submission process. Each of the different classifications has a completely different strategic trajectory, and therefore getting the FDA's buy-in early is what's going to help you make your company successful. So I'm kind of jumping ahead to those strategies right now. So this seems like a good place to stop for a pause for any questions around what we've just talked about. Is it clear to everyone? Any questions? Patrick, no questions?
No, I do not see any questions in the Q&A or chat yet.
Okay, then we'll move on because in the interest of time, I'm trying to keep us on schedule here. I think that's going to be important for all. So now let's talk about, next slide, the Q submission program. This replaced what we all old timers used to call the pre-IDE program that came into play in 1995. It's voluntary on the part of all of you that have products or are going to be submitting an application. There are a variety of different types of defined Q submission program discussions, if you will. There's the pre-sub, submission issues request, study risk determination, general information meetings, which cover everything else. And then there are some very unique and special Q submission types that kind of fit the medical device programs that are very unique and special. There is a guidance document that reflects clearly what this is all about. This is kind of an overview, but this encompasses the mechanisms that are available to you to get that feedback or have a meeting with the FDA regarding your potential or planned medical device situation. So moving on to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about what a pre-sub meeting is. It's a request to, it's a pre-sub, it's appropriate with the FDA to get feedback for special questions to guide your development or your submission. It's a formal request with written feedback, or it can be an in-person or teleconference meeting if you prefer. And it's generally related to either, do I need a device exemption? We're going to get into that. Or is this a PMA that I know I'm going to need, and so I need some guidance as to the clinical studies I may be conducting? Do I fit the de novo process, and can I get that request underway? Do I need a 510K? And in my 510K, I have some unusual questions for the submission package. I want to get the FDA's guidance. And also, am I classified as an accessory to an existing medical device? So these are the kinds of things that a pre-sub meeting can address. Next question, next slide, please. It's important to note that any of these types of Q-sub meetings are really for planned non-clinical or clinical studies, and that careful consideration of the FDA's feedback really does have an impact on the quality of your subsequent submissions. It can shorten the review time, facilitate the development of your devices, and expedite the approvals that you need simply by the transparency of the review process and getting involved with where the agency is expressing concerns. It's important to remember FDA's purpose is to protect the public. When you're bringing forth a medical device with a particular risk profile or benefits versus potential harm, your job is to help the agency get a clear picture of what data or information you have to defend that the benefit outweighs the risk. So when you think in terms of that, it becomes a little bit easier to develop your strategy. Submissions issues request is a request to FDA for a proposed approach to address issues. Once you've kind of started that interaction, you may get a letter back or some sort of information that's put you on hold, or an IDE letter. Any of these kinds of communications in which you need to talk to them about the issue before you actually propose your formal response would come under an SIR. Next slide, please. A study risk determination meeting is a request for FDA to help you understand what you need in a clinical study, the significant risk or non-significant risk, or even an exemption from IDE regulations kind of comes in to play here. And you want to get the agency's thoughts on whether or not this meets what you think it meets. This becomes pretty important sometimes when you have investors that they're not really comfortable with you telling them this is going to be a 510K submission. They want the agency's confirmation, and this is a way of getting that. It doesn't bind them, because if you come back with different context or new information, they can change their position. But it does give you documentation that shows that you have engaged with the FDA and that your thoughts are aligned. Next slide, please. A general information meeting is kind of all other activities. It's a way to share with the FDA kind of where you're going, an overview of your development. This is really important. General information meetings become very useful if you know you've got planned submissions, a number of submissions coming over the next 6 to 12 months. It familiarizes the FDA review team with kind of the significant differences in your technology from what's currently available, gives you an opportunity to kind of get in front of them some additional information. Next slide, please. This is kind of a slide that gives you the general classifications and FDA pathways. You've heard me mention 510Ks. That's referred to as getting an FDA clearance. It's for Class 2 devices. Class 3 devices are the most significant risk. They are pre-market approvals, and they require FDA approval before introduced to market. There are a number of unique alternative pathways that we talk about, the humanitarian, the de novo. There's also the exempt, which is we talked about with Class 1. All of these are risk categories associated, and the requirements for what you need to have in play and documented before you introduce your product to the marketplace is reliant on those pieces of information. Again, the risk categorization, the category classification, and then whether or not the FDA buys into that is your pathway and your determination of what actions you have to take, whether it's a 510K, a PMA, or something else. Next slide, please. So one of the things that comes into play in particular with Class 3 devices, and sometimes with Class 2 devices, is do I need an IDE or can I get an exemption? The purpose of an IDE is an investigational device exemption is to protect the public health and safety, drive ethical standards, optimize the freedom for scientific investigators to gain information about their robustness and the effectiveness of their device. And it encourages the discovery and development of the devices intended for human use. It's a pivotal decision. It has a play on your timelines, your studies, and your budget. So identifying whether or not you need an IDE or whether or not you're going to be exempt is a very important piece of information. An approved IDE permits, in reality, the device to be lawfully shipped for the purpose of conducting investigation of the device. So remember, you can't ship things without investigational use authorization. Next slide, please. So what's an investigational device exemption? It's the authorization to use it in a clinical study to collect safety and effectiveness data. It evaluates certain modifications or intended uses, even if there's an already marketed medical device. So if you have a device out there, you want to get new claims, an IDE used to study those claims that you're going to make outside of its approved use is important. That sometimes gets forgotten. PMA submissions in support of Class 3 device approvals always need an IDE. I wouldn't always say always, but you can count on it. Clinical evaluation of devices that have not been cleared for marketing require a number of things. Your IRB engagement to approve your investigation plan, informed consents on all your subjects or patients. Your device has to be prominently labeled for investigational use only before you ship it anywhere or before you do any studies on it. There has to be study monitoring, and of course there are a number of required reports and records, and the FDA approval of the IDE is required to be documented, or you need a waiver. Next slide, please. So how do you get an IDE waiver? The criteria is that it's a legally marketed device used as labeled or intended. If that's what you're doing with this device, then you have no issue. Device is being used in a manner that has non-significant risk. Again, we go back to that risk determination and the IRB's view, as well as the FDA. The device is listed in a category that's exempt, and that's the class 1 and 2 exemptions we talked about, and that's where you can find that list in the 21 Code of Federal Regulations, 862 through 892 parts. Or if it's grandfathered in from an original amendment, and that's another whole conversation that we could talk about forever, so I'll move on. Next slide, please. So the types of submissions, we touched on those earlier. Class 1, there's no FDA submission required. You need to develop and maintain general controls, which includes a quality management system and good documentation practices. Class 1 devices and Class 1-2 exempt have requirement to keep some general controls in place. And in the event that there is an issue, the agency can come in and inspect, and FDA can require some documentation. So you want to be prepared. It doesn't mean that they don't govern and control. It means that they have less concern for these categorizations. Next slide, please. So regulatory submission types and timelines. Again, Class 2s require a 510K submission. It is anticipated to have a 90-day turnaround, but quite honestly, has been on average about 9 months at this particular year. And the reality is that given the COVID circumstances we're facing right now, all of the general rules are being challenged, and it's causing folks to have a little bit of angst because of all the emergency use authorizations. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. It's a formal process with required documentation. And it's referred to as a Class 2 being general controls plus good manufacturing practices and quality management. Class 3s is the PMA submission. It's the longest timeline. The approval of devices is much longer. The average of 8 to 9 months really belongs over in Class 2. I think it, quite honestly, is the way it's going right now. Class 3 can require in excess of a year. The formal process with extensive clinical and testing data is required. Remember, this is the highest risk, and there has to be, in general, a 95% confidence level with respect to sensitivity and specificity performance. It's the highest risk category, potential to be life-threatening if it fails to perform as expected. And these kinds of things vary depending on whether or not you're talking about something that's going to sustain life or something that's going to be utilized to facilitate enhancement. And again, this is where the Class 2, Class 3 devices need to divide. The 95% confidence levels for sensitivity and specificity performance apply to IVDs. Next slide, please. So, gaining the competitive edge. There are many factors that impact the ability to obtain a regulatory approval for a medical device. And so when you think about things to consider, you want to decide, is this a product, a combination product? A combination product is one in which you're combining a drug with a device, or a biologic with a device, or even in some cases a device with another device. We have to think about the primary mode of action, and that's what takes the lead on which center in the FDA is going to actually control your process and what type of submission pathway you're going to have to follow. Is there another marketed device that's similar? This comes into play when we refer to as the predicate device. If there's another device out there that is very similar, operates in the same manner, and has the kinds of claims you're looking for, then that is your Me Too device, if you will, which we sometimes refer to as the predicate or 510K submission pathway. Does the device address an unmet medical need in the market? That's very important, not only from the perspective of how your regulatory strategy comes into play and the needs of the FDA to determine the risk benefit perspective, but also with respect to what you need to do to commercialize the product from respect of IP protection and also the market segment you're going to be trying to penetrate. What level of controls is needed to ensure that it's safe and effective all goes back into everything we've just talked about. But that level of control to maintain its safe and effective utilization, again, plays into the FDA's decision process. How will your device be classified? If you can answer these questions, you're well on your way to getting into the market quickly. Next question, next slide, please. Recommendations for sponsors and investigators: determine your device risk profile as early as possible. Review and apply the regulations and guidelines through the development and implementation of your clinical trial and on your data gathering. You really want to engage with the agency early, communicate open and frequently with them, and ensure that adequate timelines for completion of your processes have been built in to your overall business plan. Your regulatory strategy can't function independent of your overall commercialization plan and your business as a whole. There are defined timelines that one has to anticipate in order to ensure your funding is in good shape and that you're going to be able to sustain your business through the process to get the product to market. Ensure your budget and resources timelines are consistent and with the regulatory classification and approval process. And that's something you want to keep an eye on. For example, as I said earlier, during these COVID times, timelines have been greatly exaggerated from what is the norm. So looking to see how other similar products are getting to market, the timeline from submission to approval. And the agency is very good in publishing their metrics on what's their current status, will help you refine your product development cycle and your business strategy to be consistent with what is reality. You'll find that you're driven many times because we need to have an approval by a certain date to meet an investor's needs or a board's expectations. Sometimes that's outside your control, and the earlier you can get that built into the process, the more likely your success will be imminent. Your company's marketing and sales projections need to be aligned with the regulatory strategy as well. You can't plan to market and sell something that hasn't been approved by the agency. That will stop you dead in the water with a warning letter and sometimes worse. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about device documentation. How's our time going on here, Patrick? We doing okay?
Yes, I think so, Diane.
Thank you. The device documentation. You'll hear folks talk about this: a design history file, the device master record, and the device history record. All of these really boil down to, what do I need to document to make sure that I have the elements to make a good submission and to defend the efficacy and safety of my device? The DHF is a compilation of records that describes the design history of a finished device. It's everything you need to make the device. Excuse me. The device master record is the procedures and specifications for a finished device. So it's everything you need to know to build and test the device. And the device history record is the production history of a finished device. So what I encourage folks to do in medical device development is to start your design history file very early. I even have it suggest that it gets started when you're in the requirements phase of deciding what that prototype's really going to look like. Many times that becomes really important to you as you get down the road and you experience some sort of issue or unexpected event that you want to go back and look at. Could it be associated with a change that was made unexpectedly or at a point later in the development cycle? Or is there something that could have affected that? Hindsight's always 20/20. Can you see that the change you made could have caused something else to happen that probably didn't show or may have shown but was negated in the testing? So the design history file is important to be able to show everything that you did right up through the final decision of this is what the product looks like. Is one of the most critical elements, but it's sometimes overlooked until you get that prototype and you've tested it and you go, it works. And then trying to create that historical evolution to that point becomes a little foggy. I think we've kind of covered this one. I guess the only thing I would say is that CFR Part 820.40, which is 21 CFR Code of Federal Regulations, the laws really require that you maintain device master records, and 21 CFR 820.30 is the requirements for the device design history file. So these are actually built into the regulations. I'm sure all of you read the Code of Federal Regulations every night before you go to bed, so you're already familiar with that. Next slide. So what's the difference between a design and a device? The design history file contains the history. The device master record contains the documentation to build, test, package, and service. And the device history record is the information associated with each lot, batch, or unit that is talked about, and it's how you go back to trace device release and productization. Next slide. So let's talk for a few minutes about the changes in the framework for new devices and combination products. The FDA has seen a significant increase in these products. This was pre-COVID. The historical lines of separation between medical product centers has really been changing and being challenged by the new technologies and the introduction of artificial intelligence, software as a medical device, new technologies coming to market every day, and the introduction of a combination products policy council. So a lot of things have been happening over the last 5 years, I guess, with the Center for CDRH, as well as CBER and CEDAR, all three divisions. There's a combination products 101 release that came out in 2014 that I thought was really interesting. It was predicting as that long ago how big the market would be, that the drug device combination products would go to about 115 I think that was billion by 2019. But in 19, it was shown that it was growing even bigger. Next slide. Today, I think there is, if I remember correctly, I checked, it was like a 4.4 billion marketplace now. Changes have come about, and it's just magnified well beyond the millions that were projected in the between 2014 and 2019. Changes to the framework. There's a number of different things that have been implemented to address all of these changes that have been put forth. FDA.gov's website was completely refreshed. For those of us that used to know it almost by heart, it's become a whole new ballgame to try to find the information. It's much more user-friendly, but it's not as easy to get to the details that used to be there. Philosophical fostering of drug competition has come into play. Cybersecurity is a very big problem that has challenged the framework for all of the products, but seems to have a bigger issue around devices, primarily because of their connectivity. Mobile medical applications is something that's also come into play. Medical applications, software apps, med apps, has become a really unique situation in that the agency has deemed it to use enforcement discretionary enforcement of the regulations. So they look at the app and determine, is it really going to do harm again? And what's the risk profile? If something does go wrong later on, then they start applying the regulations more strictly. Wireless medical devices, software as a medical device is a whole new ballgame. Again, it depends on how that software is being used, the risk profile, the potential harm. and whether or not it's telling someone, whether it's a care provider or a patient, what we call the black box effect. In other words, it takes information in, analyzes it, and just gives direction as opposed to information. So many times when you're developing, for example, a software as a medical device, it would be great if you just gave it a red, yellow, green, or you gave it a positive or negative, or translation of information. But once you do that, you've raised the risk level of what happens when the software fails. So again, that's how you have to play in that significant risks, non-significance of risk, and where the safety profile fits. Artificial intelligence, it's really interesting. The agency is struggling with how to regulate and apply the impact of artificial intelligence. We've seen some implications in some guidance documents, but this is a whole new ball game. Combating the opioid crisis, implementing the Office of OPEQ has been a real big situation of how it fits together with everything else. There's the COVID crisis, driving excessive emergency use authorizations being issued in rapid time, and routine work being put on hold or significantly delayed. One of the things I'm watching that I think is going to be really interesting is emergency use authorization has never been applied before at this level of magnitude due to a pandemic. If you look at the issued letters of approval to use in an emergency, it all relates to the status of the pandemic. When the government officials lift the pandemic status, it's going to be interesting to see how the agency addresses the emergency use authorization. Technically, they're no longer in play, but there are going to be a lot of things out there that are we can't actually remove off the market quickly. So the question becomes, how's that going to be dealt with? This is a historically unprecedented situation, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Most companies that have an emergency use authorization for significant products that are on the market are immediately working to put together formal submissions and get the product approved beyond the emergency use. So that's the strategy I would recommend to anyone that has an emergency use authorization that intends to continue to manufacture and wants to build this product for the long haul. Next slide, please. Changes in the framework. FDA is now taking a risk-based approach to the lead role. So they look at the situation where you've got a biologics with a device, drugs with a device, devices with it, and an in vitro diagnostic kind of thing. What's the critical element? So we found that biologics with the devices, CBER leads, and the device group advises. Drugs, CDER leads, and device group advises. CDRH alone if it's a device and an in vitro diagnostic. Those are the general rules. Sometimes they go into play and they have to get back to us on who's going to be taking the lead, because again, the submission processes for CBER, CDER, and CDRH are very different. Next slide, please. So what's coming for CDRH? Over 30 years, they have issued more than 450 guidance documents, and that's not including those that have come out this year around the emergency use authorizations and the new technologies. They're constantly trying to guide what is coming, and they're finding that a huge number of the devices that have been defined as predicate devices are more than 10 years old or 20 years old, and so they're looking for ways to quickly reevaluate the drug classifications to get the age devices and classifications and address the impact of new technologies. We've seen a lot of class 2s going to class 1. Class 1 and 2 exemptions. Class 3s going to class 2s. You have to keep up with what's going on, because between the year 2019 and 2025, the agency has put a review process in place to not only address the guidance documents that are more than 10 years old, but also to look at the device classifications and the technologies and how old they are. So we're going to see a very changing arena there. And that's why when I give regulatory strategies to folks or help folks look at their products, I always encourage, keep an eye on that predicate device that you've identified. It could change its classification. So you want to keep your regulatory strategy as a living document and keep verifying that the information on the websites with a CDRH hasn't changed. Guidance documents are a good way to keep up with that as well. Next slide, please. Submissions and different communication structures are in play with structured complex timelines that have now been laid out. The agency is working on metrics as to how quickly they respond and whether or not they've met their timelines. Doesn't mean that they can't stop the clock at any given time, send you a request for additional information, or put the stop clock because something has happened that they need to assess or evaluate. But it does mean that they are monitoring their advancement of these devices to market. Seeking industry input and taking a risk-based approach. We talked about the risk-based approach, but they're also setting up subject matter experts and getting the industry to talk to them about the new technologies. And they are, I would encourage you that if you have something that is very unique and is cutting edge, invite the agency to come to your facility to see this information, or that you to come to them to just talk about this advancing technology. It helps keep them up to speed and it shows collaboration. Harmonizing the medical device regulations with ISO requirements. This has been ongoing for some time to help integrate and the expectations around the different quality management systems. The impact of the UDI it continues to grow. And again, this could be a whole presentation just on that element itself. Moving on. Next slide. So remember, failure to ensure the data and documentation you gather, produce, or reference in accordance with the requirements set forth for any particular classification or device or in vitro diagnostic, which is also a device, can result in the FDA's refusal to accept the information and therefore delay or prevent your product clearance or approval. Once you make a submission, they analyze it to determine whether or not the elements are there that they can then assess and evaluate. If they accept it, the clock starts, and then the interactions begin. You need to be prepared to check in, to answer questions quickly when they present them to you. One of the strategies that I have always used and found to be successful is that if the agency calls or sends me a letter, most companies like to step back, be thoughtful, hold meetings, do a lot of additional talking. Time is of the essence when interacting with the FDA. They pick up your portfolio, they look at it. If you have an issue, they'll communicate that issue to you. But if they don't hear from you very quickly, they put yours back in the stack and they go to the next one. So one strategy that I found to be very successful is to respond to the agency rapidly. If they send me an email, I respond right away within 24 to 48 hours. If they call, I make a point to let them know when I will get back to them, and then I meet that commitment. If they send you a letter, even if you don't have all the information, providing them what you do have and keeping them engaged with you and aware of your product and where you're standing or what's coming next helps keep your review process in play. Again, if you don't respond or it goes silent or you say, we need some time to think about this, they put you back in the stack and you go to the bottom, and it may be quite a time before they get back to you. These are extremely overworked individuals and they have a workload that is unbelievable. So they move quickly from one thing to another. Next slide. So let's talk real quickly about the types of regulations that are applicable to medical devices. I've listed the Code of Federal Regulations, which, like I said, I'm sure all of you read every night. I absolutely adore it. It's fascinating. It's a real page turner. But there's also the applicable clinical research that are used for devices, protection of human subjects. All of the things, if you've done clinical studies, apply here, but there's good laboratory practices for non-clinical laboratory studies. And again, the statutory requirements for IDEs. So there they all are. You can look them up on the FDA website, or I will be happy to send you a copy if you ask. Next slide. Here are some reference sites that you might find useful. There's the ICH for international. The WHO website has a lot of good information. Australia, Canada, the Access GUDID at NIH is very helpful. The UK government website, I listed as many as I could find to help you, but I think the first one and the third bullet are probably those that most frequently are utilized in the US for medical device. So those references and resources will help you kind of guide through what the expectations are with respect to device regulatory compliance, and is good resources to have available. I hope you find them helpful. If you find something that's of question, again, just let me know. Happy to talk with you about it. It's one of my favorite topics. Next slide, please. So after all is said and done, I just want to make sure that I have let you know that, this is a presentation for your consideration information only. I saw 3 errors already. And so, Patrick, I'm going to send you a clean set of slides to upload to the website for these guys. The quality assurance officer and me obviously failed. This came in late last night, and I didn't do as good a job as I should have in editing these slides. So I will get those corrected. Next slide, please. So this is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me via email. As I said, I'm happy to talk with you if questions come up later after you look through this, or if I overlooked something that you thought should have been presented and wasn't, my apologies. Again, this was trying to be a quick overview. My phone number is there. That's my office line. I'll be happy to share with you my private number as well. It's 919-740-1792. And during the pandemic, I'm at that number. It's my cell phone, so I'm happy to answer calls for you if you have questions. In the meantime, I think we have about, if I'm reading this correctly, a few minutes for questions. Patrick, any questions?
None at this time, but again, just a reminder, everyone, if you do have a question for Diane, please type those into the Q&A window. And we'll wait, hold on a little bit here to see if any questions come in. But before you log off today, if you wouldn't mind, we do have a brief feedback survey for everyone to complete. I dropped that link into the chat window. So if you would please fill that out before you log off, that'd be great. And we'll just hold here for another 30 seconds or so and see if any questions come in. Thank you.
So Diane, this is Mike. Thanks again for a really great presentation, and maybe just to generate a few questions to get things going. So we have about now 20 investigators in the Catalyze program, and roughly half are devices diagnostics. What are some of the common challenges or mistakes do you think that they have put into their proposals that we can improve upon for the next round?
Well, that's a good question, Mike. I think the thing that I see frequently is the drive to prototype, and there are a lot of steps in between before they get to that prototype that they really should set milestones for accomplishments. Some of the initial assumptions that folks make of availability of, for example, samples to be tested to validate or move it into the next phase becomes a real roadblock. So as you develop your device, I would say the thing to think about is, what am I going to need to get the data to defend its efficacy and safety and effectiveness? And that's something that, if you think about that early in the proposal and where you're going to get the sources from and what the requirements are around those sources, unique attributes that you need, the number of positives, the number of negatives, the carrier state, those kinds of things, in particular for in vitro diagnostics, can play very heavily. I mean, it can absolutely stop you. Then the next thing that I would say is possibly thinking through the market share that you're intending to focus on. I see sometimes that a really interesting device is coming into play, and it is a medical device, but who's going to buy it? Does it have a viable market that will pick it up and make it useful? The other thing is the human factors, thinking through, if I insert this into a muscle or into the tissue or into the heart, that raises the risk profile. Can I design it such that it lays on the top of the skin or on the chest or someplace so that it isn't invasive? Is also something that I find when I'm talking to the device developers. They go, oh yeah, we could probably do that. They just hadn't really thought about the human factors of what's going into play. So a couple things there.
Diane, I did see a question come in for the R61 and or R33 phase. Is there an expectation to already interact with the FDA? If so, should these interactions be described in the proposal? Also, it seems like July 9th is the last listed deadline for the Catalyze program. Will there be more added?
Mike, I think that question's for you.
Yeah, so we are in the process of renewing all 5 of the funding announcements for the product definition suite, and we expect to have those reissued sometime late calendar year 2021. And then for interacting with the FDA, excuse me, for the R61 and R33 phase, all that is required for the application is that you have some sort of understanding of a regulatory strategy. If you have already met with the FDA and they're helping to guide your proposal, that is information you should share with the reviewers because it helps strengthen your application.
Just to support what Mike has just said, this goes back to the presentation. What I was suggesting to you is understanding the risk profile, the significant or non-significant risks, and which classification the device will fit in is really important, not only for your funding process, but the timelines of development. And it shows that you've thought this part through. If you haven't had a conversation with the FDA, you've identified your predicate device, it fits nicely together, and you feel pretty strongly that you have a good, strong defendable position, I think putting that into your submission, along with a timeline for when you feel you'll have enough data to talk to the FDA, is a good strategy. You don't want to go talk to the FDA just to say, hey, how you doing? Here's what I've been thinking about. You want to have meaningful engagement with them. So I had a really interesting conversation with one of the investigators, probably on the phone right now. And he said, Diane, I'm not ready to go talk to the FDA yet. I want to have data before I do that. So I thought that was a really important decision, and I agree with it. The more you bring to them, the more confident they are in your decision process. So when you're building your timelines, compare that to your regulatory strategy. And when I've got data available, you don't want to say you're going to go to the FDA and present your data when your data isn't going to be available for another 6 months. So kind of align those activities. It shows your understanding and the potential impact. I hope that answered the question. Are there any other questions?
I don't see any additional questions at the moment. We do have about 3 more minutes to the top of the hour. So again, if you'd like to submit any questions for Mike or Diane, please do so now.
Okay, it sounds like someone had a puppy, and I'm not sure I understand dog. But it's going to be interesting if you have a dog working on a medical device. I wonder if that qualifies as animal studies, Patrick.
Well, I do want to draw everyone's attention to the Catalyze website, and thank you, Kim, for dropping that into the chat. Visit the website for a recording of the session following when we close out here today. And also, I also want to remind everyone to please complete the feedback survey as well. So I will take one more last call for any questions.
And if I may, Patrick, I want to thank everyone for their time and attention today. I appreciate the opportunity afforded me to talk with you. I wish you all well in your medical device development.
Great, thank you, Diane. I don't see any additional questions, so that will conclude our program today. but NHLBI and RTI appreciate your attendance, and everyone have a good day. Thank you.